In this video, I would like to briefly introduce a study that we might entitle Aspects of Negative Role Modeling in the David Bathsheba Narrative and its Sequel. The purpose of this area of study will be to examine the negative role models that are used by the biblical writers in order to see what area of wisdom are illustrated by their use. The area of this study is that of the Davidic narrative that I'll be focusing upon, and I'll be doing a number of videos as I have time, and we'll be looking especially at the aspects of negative role modeling of David and his contemporaries who are presented to us in the Hebrew text. The story that is examined, or the narrative that is examined, again, is the David Bathsheba incident recorded in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, followed by the sequence of events in the Ammon, Tamar, Absalom narrative. The development of this story, first of all, will be to examine the author's overall purpose in the Davidic narrative in an effort to see that it is more than a simple cessation narrative of political information, but that it contains wisdom, instruction, and moral judgment. Then, as we have time, I would like to tell the narrative of David, or the story of David, and in so doing, endeavor to show the points of wisdom that are subtly, and sometimes not so subtly embedded in the narrative of 2 Samuel 11 to 14. There is a phrase that occurs throughout. It is the phrase Vayishlach, and he sent. In the David or the Davidic and Bathsheba story, as it presents to our understanding what we call an important lead vort, motif, as it were, where the verb shalach is used to teach wisdom. And that phrase, I should say, is used to teach wisdom. And it is interesting, it occurs where we see Yahweh finally sending Vayishlach. The verb is examined as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, or will be examined, in an effort to understand its meaning and usage. And then the results of this particular investigation will be related to the use of the verb shalach in the Davidic story. Finally, I want to conclude this study with some summary conclusions given as to how the author of Samuel uses literary art to communicate his ideas, followed by a summary then of the wisdom ideas which the writer seems to communicate. That basically is what I would like to embark on and slowly, as I have time, discuss it. Let me begin by looking at what I am going to try to do. In recent times, there is often an emphasis in biblical studies looking at a literary analysis of the text in an effort to observe how authors develop biblical narratives. The purpose of this study will be to explore, particularly then, the literary dynamics of the David Bathsheba story and its sequel, that is, the Ammon Absalom account. This exploration may lead to the identification of certain didactic conclusions, as well as moral and ethical themes, which the biblical writer desired to communicate, I believe, to his audience. From the outset, it should be noted that there are many ways of looking at and interpreting a biblical narrative. The approach in what we are trying to do is to concentrate on only one of the means whereby a text may be studied, without implying that this is the only method of doing so. Throughout history, both Jewish and Christian scholars have interpreted the Bible from various hermeneutical approaches, demonstrating that the text was believed to have different layers of meaning. An example of this can be found in the Jacob narrative. It is clear that one interpretive purpose of the text is to develop the covenant recorded in Genesis 12, 1-3, which promised that Abraham would become a great nation and that God would bless him along with his descendants. This theme of blessing and the growth of Abraham's offspring is then clearly seen in the repetition of the covenant blessing to both Isaac and Jacob in Genesis 26:28 and following. And the Jacob story is the illustration of the development then of Abraham's family into various tribes, which would subsequently become a nation. Surely then, a primary purpose in the telling of the Jacob narrative is to show how the seed of Abraham expands into the 12 tribes and to illustrate how God carries out his covenant promise to Jacob by its repetition throughout the story. At the same time, when the Jacob story is read, an ethical interpretation becomes evident. Jacob is pictured as deceiving his father, who would not see, so by covering his body with a skin to conceal his true identity. As a result, he steals his father's blessing from his brother Esau, who is the firstborn. Later, Jacob flees and goes to Laban, where he works 7 years to gain Rachel. On the wedding day, the bride of Jacob is veiled, and he cannot tell that it is not Rachel. The previous scenario is therefore reversed. Laban deceives Jacob by giving him Leah, who is the firstborn and not the younger, thus showing an ethical retribution. The text shows Laban uttering an ironic statement. It is not so done in our place to give the younger daughter before the firstborn in Genesis 29, 1-6. The narrator does not stop with this example of the cause and effect and dynamic of deception. Later it pictures Judah, Jacob's son, as deceiving his father with Joseph's garment, just as Jacob had deceived his father earlier with a garment. This repetition allows one to conclude that there is an ethical and moral purpose in the way in which the writer develops the narrative. This ethical concern of the text is also illustrated in the case of Judah's deception by the literary repetition of the phrase hakarna and the verb yakar in Genesis 37, 32 to 33, and 38, 35 to 26. Judah, along with his brothers, asked Jacob, "Do you know if this is your son's coat or not?" In Genesis 37, 32 to 33. The text then says that Jacob knew, Genesis 37, 33. Judah later is deceived by Tamar, his daughter in law, who asks the very same question: "Do you know whose these are?" referring to his signet, cords, and staff that he had left with her as a pledge when he was deceived by her, Genesis 38:25, thinking she was a harlot. The text then continues, and Jacob knew, Genesis 38:26. The repetition cannot be accidental, but is part of the narrator's literary means of teaching an ethical and moral lesson, that of a cause and effect relationship. What Judah does in deceiving his father is enacted in a similar way upon him. Both Jacob and Judah deceive, and then each in turn is deceived. This is one purpose of the narrative, though certainly not the only one. Nonetheless, it is clear that the author develops didactic themes in the Jacob story. In the Davidic story as well, then, several didactic purposes are evidenced in the way the narrator or the narrative is told. And what I'd like to do is stop and then later pick that up and track some of the ways that the writer of Samuel is doing the same thing, developing through a literary way the teaching of ethics and morals.